Right, I need to talk about Almaz. I said I'll take a break from both spaceflight and generally Soviet stuff for a while, but this side quest is far too interesting, and it's like it was designed to fit perfectly between my last video and my next one. At the end of that video, I realised that there is an Almaz space station in the British Isles. We'll visit it later, and you'll see some footage of it throughout. In addition, I've also managed to get hold of a copy of this book. No official Soviet or Russian government documents regarding Almaz have ever been published, but this is a detailed account from MPO Mashinostroyevenia, the modern-day incarnation of the design bureau that designed and built Almaz. This will be the main source for this video. Being a side quest, this is a little shorter than my usual videos, but it's going to be very information-dense. If you clicked on this in order to hear about the gun, you can just skip forward to the last chapter. It is kind of a standalone video, that part. I don't think you should. The story of Almaz is really interesting, but the option is there. A final word before we get started. The model I used for Almaz contains that white belt with a SAlyut label. We'll get to why it said SAlyut in a second, but after making all those renders, I discovered that belt may have been a launch fairing and would have possibly been jettisoned before reaching orbit. I just wanted to point that out as a potential mistake on my part. Every space station to date, with the exception of Skylab and Tiangong 1 and 2, is a direct derivative of Almaz. You've probably heard of the SAlyut program, but what was Almaz? Let's jump straight to the hero of today's story, Vladimir Shalomet. The Soviet space program, if you want to call it a unified space program, encompassed hundreds of disparate design bureaus, or OKBs. Honestly, for all intents and purposes, they were the equivalent of Western defence contractors. And the staff and heads of all the various OKBs generally hated each other. The most famous was OKB-1, which built the R-7 and was headed by Sergei Korolev. You may have also heard of Valentin Glushko, the head of OKB-456, which built the best engines in the Soviet Union, and Glushko was eventually the successor as head of OKB-1 after Korolev's death. The third Soviet space titan was Shalomet, head of OKB-52. That OKB is most famous for the Proton rocket. During the early 1960s, OKB-52 began designing the world's first space station. Almaz was shrouded in secrecy as its defining feature was the AGAT, or Agate, ground observation telescope. With an 88cm mirror, it would be capable of resolving features on the Earth's surface down to a resolution of about 1 metre. You see, Almaz was a spy satellite, but it bears the distinction of being the only crewed spy satellite ever launched into orbit. The basic hull template for the stations is the OPS, or Orbital Piloted Station, and was well into development by the late 1960s. The US was far into development of their own crewed spy satellite, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. However, the Americans had also invested heavily in the Corona program. These were automated spy satellites which would automatically take high-resolution photographs and return them to Earth via capsules that were recovered in mid-air using a modified aircraft. It really is unbelievable that this was possible, but it was. To me, this really underscores the bigger picture the US was working towards in space during the early 1960s. Though public perception may have been that the Soviets were ahead, the US had an automated spy satellite network by 1961 and a global positioning system by 1964. Anyway, taking photos of the USSR and parachuting them back is all well and good if we ignore the fact that many of the areas of interest spend a majority of the time under clouds. And automating the entire process doesn't allow operators to assess photos and make follow-up observations quickly. A trained crew in orbit would be able to identify visible targets, make their own assessments, and feed their evaluations back to ground crew in near real time. Of course, history has shown us it's still more efficient to just brute force the problem by launching multiple uncrewed satellites and returning as many photos as possible. That is why the Manned Orbiting Laboratory never launched with a crew, and it's why the Soviets only launched 3 Almaz stations. As 1969 came about and the US put 2 men on the moon, the leadership at OKB-1, who were particularly politically astute, saw an opportunity. depending on how you want to interpret history, they either acquired or just stole several OPS hulls from OKB-52 and fitted them with electronics and various other hardware from their Soyuz vehicle. Just 1 year after acquiring the hulls, the world's first space station, SAlyut 1, was launched. The infusion of Soyuz hardware into the OPS hull created the DOS, or Durable Orbital Station. SAlyut 1 was the first of many DOS modules launched into orbit. Unfortunately, I do need to take a really upsetting tangent here. I feel that I have to mention that although SAlyut 1 itself was a success as a space station, the crew died on return to Earth as a result of poor quality control and possibly design flaws on their Soyuz spacecraft, almost certainly due to the rush to get the station to orbit. I won't show it here, but I do encourage any engineers or managers who work with life-critical systems to watch the footage of doctors trying to revive the cosmonauts. It's not nice, but it's an honest record of what screwing up looks like if you design systems that keep people alive. Okay, there were 7 space stations officially named SAlyut, but behold Soviet deception at its finest. 3 of them were not DOS modules. 3 of them were OPS hulls fitted with that ground observation telescope, along with various other spy hardware. You see, SAlyuts 2, 3, and 5 were actually Almaz stations. To keep things simple, we'll refer to them as Almaz 1, 2, and 3. So a quick summary. SAlyut 1 was the world's first crewed space station. SAlyut 2 was actually Almaz 1. It failed as soon as it reached orbit due to the upper stage of the Proton rocket exploding. SAlyut 3 was actually Almaz 2. It was the first crewed Almaz station, and also happened to be the one with the gun. SAlyut 4 was successful, and that was visited by 2 crews. SAlyut 5 was actually Almaz 3. This was also a success and was visited by 2 crews. SAlyut 6 and 7 were long-duration stations and were incredibly successful. We'll come back to them in the next chapter. In addition to the primary telescope, Almaz had a stereographic camera for recording terrain data and a somewhat advanced infrared detector. The crew would carry out observations from this control station here. It reminds me of the weird cramped control room in the movie Dark Star. Here we can see the periscopes used for external observation and for observation through the telescope. You'll note the now somewhat iconic Globus mechanical computer used to convey the station's relative position to Earth. Photos from the Agate telescope, along with the other ancillary observation instruments, were stored on photographic film, which was primarily returned to Earth via dedicated return capsules, just like the US Corona satellites. The capsules weighed 400 kilograms fully laden, and were 85 centimeters in diameter. Supply craft would fly up replacement capsules which could be reloaded with new film. After separation from the station, a solid rocket motor would deorbit the capsule, allowing it to re-enter the atmosphere and land in a designated 200 by 50 kilometer ellipse. Though Almaz was never occupied long-term, and the crew visits were more for testing than for serious operational observation, the film return capability was tested and was a success, with a capsule being recovered on the ground and the photos being successfully developed. Talking about film cameras and spaceflight in the same sentence sounds bizarre. The two sound like they're from different eras. By complete coincidence, a couple of months before I started making YouTube videos, I bought a film camera. I don't take many photos, and having a nice clicky-clacky mechanical camera is the only way I can force myself to take photos of my family. The photo enlarger I used to develop my photos just so happens to be from the Soviet Union too. I have a Soviet one because it was really cheap. So, you can watch me developing some photos while I discuss how the cosmonauts did it using a similar process. A standout advantage to having crew on board was the ability to develop photos in orbit and therefore see the results within minutes. Much like my attic here, Almaz could be converted into a darkroom by closing the shutters and turning off the lights. There was a photo enlarger, probably quite similar to mine. The crew would develop a small section of the 1 kilometer film cassette in a dark box. Yeah, Almaz carried 1 kilometer of film in each return capsule, and that was complete with 9 kilograms of explosives which would detonate if the capsule landed outside the Soviet Union. The developed film would then be inserted into an enlarger and used to produce the final image. Of course, they'd have to have some kind of closed container to contain the developer and fixer fluid in zero gravity. Just imagine what you're seeing on screen now, but enclosed. The developed images were transmitted back to ground using an analog broadcasting camera for immediate analysis, and the film was returned in the capsule to ensure that ground crew received the high-resolution photos. Something I'm always wary of when making videos is figuring out to what degree things actually existed. It's quite common for modern-day commentators to inadvertently sing the praises of something which only ever existed on paper, whilst criticising something else which was actually built due to its real-world flaws. If something never existed, we never find out about those flaws. Buran is the most famous what-could-have-been project for Soviet spaceflight. The truth is, the Soviets designed a competitor to Buran, which, well, it just looks like a better overall system to me. The second major component of the Almaz program was arguably the most promising abandoned Soviet spacecraft in history, the TKS. Before we go any further, I just want to stress again, I do not fawn over things that never existed. TKS flew as a complete system 4 times, and flew successfully all 4 times. It never flew with a crew in its intended configuration though, so it's fair to say it flew a lot more than Buran, but never served its intended purpose. 2 TKS cargo blocks are in orbit right now, repurposed as crewed modules for the International Space Station, and 4 were used on Mir. The TKS was never truly abandoned, it just ended up serving a different purpose. After the Almaz OPS hull, TKS cargo blocks are the second most prolific space station module design ever launched. You usually get a secondary theme in my videos. The secondary theme in this one is rules. There are a lot of unwritten rules in engineering, and casual observers like to parrot them back as if they are gospel. One famous so-called rule is to never fly crew and cargo together. Something like the space shuttle is an example of how focusing on both leads to a system which may be dangerous for crew and expensive for cargo. The TKS broke this rule, and it's really difficult to argue against the logic. You can fly crew and cargo, just keep them separate. The crew would launch and return to Earth in a 3-seater craft known as the VA capsule. Atop this was a collection of thrusters used for on-orbit manoeuvring. At the very top was the solid-fuel deorbit motor. For launch, the entire assembly would be topped with a large launch escape tower. I haven't modelled that here, but here is an original physical model showing it. The entire assembly could fly independently, keeping the crew and cargo somewhat separate during operations, and the launch escape system would carry the crew module clear in the case of an incident. A hatch in the capsule heat shield connected to that independent cargo section, the functional cargo block, or FGB. The cargo block was capable of delivering up to 5.2 tons of material to low Earth orbit. That may not sound like much, but with the addition of the crew, a single TKS could deliver the equivalent of 3 Progress launches and 1 Soyuz launch, all in one go. And in addition, it'd deliver a new pressurized module to Almaz in the form of the functional cargo block itself. The cargo block could function as an independent spacecraft and was controlled from a dedicated station at the rear. We saw these stations in the FGB service modules on Mir. Also worthy of note, the VA capsule was also designed to launch atop an Almaz, providing a means of delivering and returning the initial crew, though again this never actually happened. 8 VA spacecraft flew independently of the cargo blocks for testing. They were launched in pairs for cost efficiency. In fact, an additional 2 launched, but their rocket blew up. The entire TKS assembly was launched 4 times and flown standalone and automated on the first 2 launches. The last 2 launches are particularly interesting. The first of those docked with SAlyut 6. This was after the station's final crew had left, but the TKS remained docked to SAlyut 6 for just over a year until the station deorbited. The final TKS docked with SAlyut 7 while it was crewed, and it was subsequently visited by a second crew, the crew of the legendary Soyuz T-15. Now that is off topic here, but I'm going to include an animation of it while I speak. Mir is almost universally referred to as the first modular space station. The fact that the Soviets were rather quiet about the existence of TKS at the time apparently means the two final Salyuts are rarely considered. Considering the TKS delivered to Salyut 7 was designed specifically to be inhabited by crew, contained many scientific experiments, and remained docked for 5 years, I consider at the very least Salyut 7 to be the first true modular station. Though the Americans were somewhat in the dark when it came to TKS, they did capture this particularly impressive radar image shortly before Salyut 7 deorbited, clearly showing the docked craft. TKS really does seem to make a lot of sense in principle. Of course, no system is perfect, and though we can only evaluate the TKS to a point since it never flew with crew, there are a few disadvantages that spring to mind. The first is its utilisation capacity. The all-up launch mass was 21.5 tons. If TKS spacecraft were used to replenish crew and cargo on a 6-monthly basis to Almaz, I do wonder how economical it'd be. It's not as if they'd be leaving the FGB behind every single time to create an ever-growing station. Would disposing that big module every time be cost-effective? I'm not really sure. I think the closest we've had since the TKS was the ATV, which flew to the ISS a few times, and has since been developed into the service module for Orion. Both these spacecraft need a heavy launcher every time. And that's another issue. TKS launched atop the Proton rocket. Proton is fueled by unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine, UDMH, and nitrogen tetroxide. That combination ignites on contact, so are referred to as hypergolic. Many chemical pairs are hypergolic, but for now let's just use that term for UDMH and nitrogen tetroxide. Both are pretty awful if you're a human, but the hydrazine is the one you want to worry about the most. I cannot believe how toxic hydrazine is. I find it incredible engineers are able to handle and use the stuff in the quantities required for spaceflight. And it's killed thousands on the ground over the years. Korolev and Chalamet were staunchly opposed to flying crew on hypergolic rockets, and I can't say I disagree with them. But remember that thing about rules. The idea of sitting atop 250 tons of hydrazine, the Americans would never.
Want to be dominated? We'll dominate you. We'll ask you to be gentle.
But now consider launching from the lunar surface. If that engine on the Apollo ascent vehicle didn't ignite, the crew were dead. Hypergolics don't require a fancy ignition system, and they don't require much active cooling or large amounts of insulation to keep them liquid. If you want to build an engine you know will ignite when you need it, hypergolics are your friend. This goes for RCS and orbital maneuvering systems too. Every crewed spacecraft I'm aware of uses hypergolics for its maneuvering fuel. So yes, they're horrible, but looking at the bigger picture, a little hypergolics, as a treat, makes everything safer. And just in case I won you over there, everything is a trade-off. The American crew of Apollo-Soyuz very nearly died on their return to Earth when nitrogen tetroxide got into the crew compartment. If that was the hydrazine instead, I'm pretty sure they'd be goners. Anyway, Chalamet proposed a kerosene-fueled variant of the Proton to more safely deliver the crewed TKS to orbit. But by this point, Glushko had the greatest influence over leadership, and the Energia Buram was eating up any available funding, stopping TKS flying in its original design. But there is a strange epilogue to that story. Alright, let's go and visit some actual Almaz hardware. It is, after all, the reason I'm making this video in the first place. I vaguely remember 15 years or so ago reading about some Soviet hardware arriving on the Isle of Man. I would have ignored the news back at the time. Back then, every multimillionaire was trying to get in on a kind of space boom, and most of the ventures were clearly going nowhere. Oh, and also, here's what coverage of science-related news looks like in the UK.
It looks like a glorified beer keg.
It was built by the Russians in the 1980s to spy on countries like America and Britain.
And launch as NASA turns to the private sector to
Virgin Galactic will take tourists into low Earth orbit next year. Their kit may be a relic of the Cold War, but as these pictures show, they've been in space before and could go again.
It's okay.
Okay, for the now in the future.
You would go up to space in this.
Why not? I'm ready.
You're ready? Okay,
If you are going to, let's go together.
I'm not sure how recognisable the Isle of Man is to viewers outside the British Isles. It's here. It isn't actually a part of the UK, but it kind of is. Let's not get into that now. Somewhat embarrassingly, I'd never actually been before, so I booked a flight and hired a car to get me here, the Isle of Man Motor Museum. Now, this video is not sponsored or endorsed in any way by the museum, but take it from me, it's worth going over to the Isle just to visit this museum. It's amazing. They have the quirkiest collection of vehicles I've ever seen, kept in excellent condition. Dennis, the founder, was an absolute delight to chat with, and I had a great day all round. Hell, I even had time to drive the TT mountain course, climb Snaefell, see a cool steam train, and look around a nice castle, all in a day. So, yeah, visit the Isle of Man. It's cool. You all want to see the Peel P50, don't you? Alright, fine. Here it is. But back to Almaz. Here it is. Excalibur Almaz was the company behind all this. They purchased 2 OPS hulls and 4 VA capsules from Russia back around 2010. They've since dissolved and sold off most of their hardware, but 2 VA capsules and an Almaz hull now reside here. Here I am for scale. No, I'm a terrible scale reference. I'm tiny, 165 centimetres and 62 kilograms. But that makes me around the size of a Soviet cosmonaut, so you get the point. What are we looking at here? This is an Almaz OPS pressure hull. There are at least 3 of these left in existence, and this is the least complete. One is in Moscow, so no chance of me visiting that anytime soon. The other was on the Isle of Man for a while, but was sold off to a private buyer. I tried to track it down, but I've got no idea where it went. The one here is literally just the pressure vessel, but it's great to see the scale of the station in person. Definitely bigger than it looks in renders. Looking in through the windows at each end, we see where the main telescope would have sat and divided the main crew area. I was surprised to see the various holes in the bottom for all the other instrumentation, including the IR camera, terrain camera, and periscope. Even more surprising, the number of windows. There's loads of them. Of course, these ones at the end would have been hatches, but all the other ones would be available for observations. Alright, now let's take a look at the VA spacecraft. Again, these are little more than just pressure vessels now. They have no real avionics, no heat shield, and no manoeuvring system. Again, these are much bigger in person than you may suspect. They dwarf the return module of a Soyuz, though don't forget Soyuz also had a pressurized orbital module. Remember, alone, these are just designed to get a crew of 3 back to Earth. This one has actually been to space twice, on 2 of those test launches I mentioned earlier. It's outfitted with crew seats and even some kind of replacement control panel. I'm not sure if that is a mock-up or not, but it's certainly not the original control panel. Here is the original control panel from the VA capsule. Yeah, that somehow survived and is here too. I did ask if the Globus computer still works, and apparently it still moves, so that's really cool. Also note that mechanical clock. If you want more information on those, Curious Mark is the channel to go to. Now, let's look at the other capsule. This one had no furnishings whatsoever, but that is what I wanted because I was most interested in the hatch in the base. And yes, they did actually fit the crew hatch that would have passed through the heat shield. I was curious as to whether this was just a paper design or something that actually flew, and it looks like it did. As far as I'm aware, that's the only time a crew hatch has passed through a heat shield, and it looks like it worked and survived re-entry. That's just a little bit more evidence to support the case that TKS was viable from a technical perspective. It's unclear exactly what Excalibur Almaz hoped to achieve. They apparently had plans to turn this hull into a space hotel. They wanted to fit this shell of a VA spacecraft with guidance, thrusters, a heat shield, an orbital module, an escape rocket, a rocket to actually launch it. You know, the rest of the owl. I swear a lot in real life. I don't on YouTube. This video is challenging me there, though. Anyway, amongst their many and varied proposals was the design and construction of an orbital module for the VA capsule. For those who've watched my video about Mir, people are always obsessed with toilets in space. I find it pretty hilarious that Excalibur Almaz felt the need to point out the presence of an enclosed toilet in their low-poly render, just to reassure their prospective market of billionaire space tourists. Aside from space tourism, they seem to propose robotic experiments, a lunar flyby, and finally, asteroid mining, or something. I'll leave it to the viewer to decide exactly what their intentions were. Almaz 2 had a gun on it. That's what we're all here for, isn't it? Many people picture combat in space looking like this. The reality is much cooler. So let's talk about it. I think I can actually add a bit more to the conversation. It's the only time we know of that a gun was fired in space, and it's sometimes presented as this fearsome and terrifying weapon. In reality, it was just a bit of a daft afterthought and was probably born out of paranoia. The gun was added as a test. The Soviets wanted to ascertain whether it would be possible to sight, aim and fire a gun in space without it jamming due to, say, vacuum welding. As we shall see, Almaz 2's gun could, in theory, be used as a defensive measure in a very specific set of circumstances, but it was very clearly there solely as a test article. The gun itself was a modified Richter R-23. That's a 23mm autocannon used in the tailgun emplacement of a Tu-22 bomber. Some sources state the version used on Almaz used 14mm ammunition, but the report from MPO Mashinostroyenia states it was of 23mm caliber. When used on Earth, this had an exceptionally high firing rate of about 2,300 rounds per minute, but the report states after modification for use on Almaz, the firing rate was about 900 rounds per minute. So it was more of a rather than a brrr situation. I'm sure the gun itself is interesting if you're a firearms nerd, but I'm not. Here's a datasheet. I'm sure someone will enjoy that. So, let's see what we had to work with on Almaz. The gun was mounted directly to the hull here. It was not on a gimbal, so the RCS thrusters on the station had to be fired to point it at a target. Sighting was carried out through a dedicated periscope, the so-called one. The cosmonauts did test out the sighting system by aligning the viewfinder to stars, but they said, quote, "It's one thing to aim at a fixed star and quite another to aim at a moving interceptor," end quote. My intro was an attempt at an accurate depiction of the single test firing. This was carried out hours before Almaz 2 was deorbited. It did not destroy a test satellite, as some sources claim. As we shall see, even with crew on board, to aim, that would be borderline impossible. But it did fire either 3 rounds or 3 bursts, depending on how you translate the accounts. They were fired in the retrograde direction to the station travel. If we take fire a gun in space without shaking the station apart as a measure of success, the test firing was a success. For the rest of this video, we'll stray into the hypothetical. Let's see how useful that gun would be on a space station equipped with only 1970s technology. Okay, let's assume the crew notice an interceptor satellite and for whatever reason decide it needs to be destroyed. We'll go with the ideal situation of an interceptor approaching from behind and in a lower orbit, so Almaz is oriented to shoot it down. We get lined up, get the target in the middle of our viewfinder, and fire. No air resistance or gravity in space, right? So an easy shot. Welcome to the world of orbital mechanics. We just injected our bullets into a lower orbit. Here's how that looks in reality. The so-called one periscope had no compensation for gravity drop or rotation, so there is no way anyone is hitting anything further than about point-blank range without a gimbal and a targeting computer. Hilariously, and just a thought, a recalibrated turret from a B-29, as covered in my previous video, could probably do a half-decent job of this. Assuming you could make it work in vacuum, which you probably couldn't. Anyway, as I've already made clear, the fixed gun on Almaz 2 was clearly just there as a test. But there is one scenario where it would be a valid defensive weapon. The space shuttle, which was in early development, had a huge cargo bay. In fact, it could theoretically fit an Almaz station inside it if we ignore the solar arrays and the antennas and, the fact that Almaz could just do this. Okay, the theory of a shuttle kidnapping a Soviet station or satellite is purely a Soviet conspiracy theory. I want to make that really clear. The shuttle was never designed to do that. And I don't think anyone in Soviet leadership actually took that supposed threat seriously. But, well, the heads of OKBs were good at frightening leadership and convincing them to allocate funds based on military applications. So let's just pretend a shuttle or something else decides to intercept Almaz. The shuttle would probably come in on an R-bar approach like this, either above or below the station from the perspective of Earth. We'll just make up some ridiculous fanfiction to explain how the solar arrays, etc. would be dealt with. I don't know, maybe a second manipulator arm would rip them off and spray silly string into the RCS thrusters to block them. Whatever. Okay, so we sit still, wait, and when they're right upon us, spin around and absolutely let them have it. So, you just shot down your own spacecraft. Take a seat, let's go back and let's see where you screwed up. Ah, yeah, orbital mechanics again. It's surprisingly easy to shoot yourself in space. We just injected somewhere between several and hundreds of tiny lead slugs into an orbit that crosses ours. They're untrackable with 1970s radar, so it has now become a game of probability whether they actually fly back into us. If any one of those was fired off at exactly the correct velocity, it's guaranteed to hit us. So not only do we now have to maintain a database of probable off-limit orbits, but we need to maneuver to avoid being hit. If for whatever reason an interceptor tried a Z-bar approach like this, the speed of the bullets doesn't even matter. A single bullet fired 90 degrees out of plane is guaranteed to hit us halfway around the Earth. And by the way, this is why the test firing was carried out retrograde. The bullets would have burned up in the atmosphere shortly after being fired. A change in prograde speed of only about 50 meters per second was required to deorbit Almaz, and the gun fired at about 680 meters per second. I did do the maths, by the way. You need to fire about 7,000 bullets prograde to deorbit the station. Actually more than I'd have guessed. I suppose bullets have a very low specific impulse due to their low speed when compared to rocket exhaust. That's another complication. If we're firing the gun, we need to compensate with the station's thrusters, not only to maintain orientation, but also to keep our orbit. The logical conclusion of all of this is if we insist on shooting at each other in orbit, the primary means of doing so will be with missiles, not with guns. Though the gun on Almaz 2 is the most famous component, it was actually part of a larger suite of defensive measures. The station also had an infrared directional finder which would be used to detect enemy missile launchers. Again, like the gun, this was just added for testing, but it was successfully used to detect missiles launched from a vessel in the Pacific. The report states 10 launchers were successfully detected with this finder. Collectively, Almaz's defensive suite was known as Shield 1. Yes, let's all have a laugh. The Russian word for shield is shit, so it was Shit 1. But Almaz 2 had no means to evade an oncoming missile. That's where the proposed but never flown Shit 2 system would come in. This had replaced the gun with 2 interceptor missiles. The Soviets even built these to at least some extent, but never actually flew them. It's not entirely clear whether these would be capable of intercepting an incoming missile, or whether they were designed to preemptively strike other satellites in orbit. Flares would be used as an additional active countermeasure against incoming missiles. The obvious question many will be asking now is, could a properly gimbaled gun and targeting computer be used as a last line of defense against enemy missiles, also known as a point defense cannon or PDC? Let's take a look at that scenario. If we assume Almaz is targeted by a ground-based interceptor, we have a scenario where the missile is fired on a ballistic trajectory which intersects the station's orbit at just the right time. If we optimistically assume the gun could be sighted out to 10 kilometers, a very optimistic estimate, we'd want to put as much lead downrange as possible. So that definitely means upgrading to a gun that goes brrrt. Probably include a few of them too. We wait until the missile is in range and fire. Okay, what happened? PDCs are probably as good as useless with today's orbital technology, let alone that during the 1970s. However fast you picture things moving in orbit, they move faster than that. That scenario saw an interceptor approaching at a closing speed of 7 kilometers a second. Even if we fired when it was 10 kilometers out and hit it first time, we still have a dead interceptor or cloud of debris heading towards us at 7 kilometers per second. That gives us less than a quarter of a second to accelerate away from the oncoming debris. Almaz 2's main engines could deliver about 6 kilonewtons of thrust combined. So if we were firing them at full thrust and had lined up perpendicular to the interceptor, we'd move a relative distance of 3 millimeters in that time. For PDCs to work in orbit, you need probably 2 orders of magnitude higher thrust and probably 10 times the targeting range on your guns than we're capable of today. And that really brings us to the bigger problem here. As soon as we start blowing up satellites in orbit, we create clouds of debris travelling around the Earth at 7 kilometers per second. Guns are even worse. Thousands of bullets fired prograde represent at best a statistical gamble for any future missions across a whole band of orbits. You can never guarantee one of those untracked projectiles won't hit something, and you can't really be sure when they'll re-enter Earth's atmosphere either. On-orbit warfare would likely become mutually assured destruction, but in space. If I can't go to orbit, nobody can. Luckily, we all came together and agreed not to put weapons in space ever again, and everybody lived happily ever after. The end. Yeah, but what about the end?